So, yeah, okay. Great. Hopefully everything will work. Hello, everybody. Good morning. So first of all, thanks to the organizers to arrange this great meeting, working on it since several years now. Yeah, and thanks to give me the opportunity to give this talk today. It's not about my recent research. It's about a model which is developed in cooperation of some guys from the biopsychology in Bochum, Gesa Beretz, Julian Packeiser, Uno Gündiken, and Sebastian. Gesa and Sebastian are also here. And we put together our knowledge or our expertise from human and animal research to develop an idea how functional lateralization, how hemispheric dominance is generated within specific situations. So unfolding functional brain lateralization. And we call our model the asymmetrical priors model. Yeah, but what is it about? So you all know that structural and behavioral asymmetries are widespread in the animal kingdom. So we find anatomical, behavioral lateralizations in very complex brains, very complex animals, but also within very primitive, simple organisms. This means lateralization has a long evolutionary history and must provide some profound evolutionary benefit. And accordingly, we have some important influential models explaining the phylogenetic origin, the phylogenetic advantages of having a lateralized brain. And we also know a lot about the ontogenetic mechanisms. We have several ideas about the impact of genes and the environment. We just heard about it from Chris within the last talk. But what we do not know that well is how hemispheric asymmetries shape the dynamic interactions of an organism with its environment. Or this means, what are the mechanisms through which hemispheric specializations are used effectively? And only this can provide an evolutionary advantage. And this is a little bit the discussion we already often had yesterday and even some minutes ago. So at which level lateralization within an ecological valid situation emerges. So consider this. When you're looking to this, when you are looking to this complex picture, you may directly identify Sebastian. This is, by the way, a picture from the last meeting in the last laterality meeting in Dundee. It was from a visit of St. Andrews. Yeah, and while detecting Sebastian, your right hemispheric face recognition network is activated, and we can ask, how does the right hemisphere knows that there is a face? Or consider this example. So we know, we also heard it yesterday from time to time, that the left hemisphere is typically superior in analyzing fine details of objects. This is true for the little chicks, but this is also true for other animals. While the right hemisphere is specialized to detect dangers, predators, something like that. By the way, you also have seen this picture yesterday, and when I'm thinking about it, I realized that you will see in my talk some pictures you have already seen yesterday, and maybe we can do a memory game of it. Within which talk do you have seen this picture? Yeah, you can think about it. Anyway, So here the main point is, okay, within a specific situation, the left hemisphere can do this. Object analysis, for example, when the little chick is foraging, it's the left hemisphere which takes over the discrimination between eatable grains and uneatable pebbles or so, while the right hemisphere is scanning the surrounding to detect potential predators. So, but how is it possible that the two hemispheres can do both in parallel? How is the information from the complex environment parceled out to the appropriate specialized expert hemispheres? And how does this leads to adaptive behavior? Yes, so our question is, how does the brain distribute functions and parcels out information to the hemispheres to adapt processing to current situations, but also to needs or motivation? And this is what is our model about. It aims to explain lateralized information processing independently from specific neuronal models. So it should be a general model extracting the major aspects. And therefore, it aims to identify shared properties of lateralized information processing across cognitive domains and species. So it's not only about the human brain, it's about the brain of hopefully most bilaterian animals. It should cover all sub-processes of information processing, from stimulus encoding up to action generation. And in the end, it tries to explain at which level of processing functional lateralization arises and how this leads to hemispheric dominance for behavior responses, as I have already indicated. So at first, I should define our model. It says, independently of sensory modality, cognitive system, and species, functional hemispheric asymmetries arise early at the perceptual processing stream whenever the relevant features of a stimulus category, and we label them priors, are detected. Owing to the endogenously lateralized organization of the underlying neuronal networks, spike density activity in one hemisphere increases and provides one hemisphere with an activity advantage, which is maintained but not induced by top-down and interhemispheric mechanisms until a behavioral response. So in the following, I will outline this idea, this model, supported by some examples. There are examples from many species, but for this talk, I will confine my support from by data from human research, and in the end, we will prove our model from data of from pigeon research. So let's start. So we all know we have functional or hemispheric specializations, which are based on structural left-right differences. We know them quite well concerning the human cerebral cortex. We heard a lot about it yesterday. We have asymmetries in cortical thickness and surface size, in surface area size, and the density of the gray matter, and so on and so forth. But we also know that these structural asymmetries do not directly explain functional dominance. So, for example, none of the observed cortical asymmetries are directly correlate with handedness. But what these asymmetries do is, so asymmetries in the organization of neuronal networks indicate differences in neuronal processing. And this can lead to a differential sensitivity towards specific stimulus characteristics. favoring one hemisphere in detecting and or processing specific stimulus types or configurations. And this may lead to hemispheric specific encoding strategies. Think about this local processing style of the left hemisphere and the more global configurational style of the right hemisphere. And in the end, this may predispose one hemisphere for taking over a specific function, but it's not inherent to this structured organization. We need something more, which triggers the activation of the specialized brain site or the specialized neuronal network within the left or right hemisphere. So this means we have to know at which level of the processing stream functional lateralization starts. So, and we think it starts early during sensory processing. As Kenneth yesterday already indicated, we can observe activity differences between the left and right hemisphere within primary sensory areas when analyzing words, when you are analyzing faces, or when you hear speech. So we have we already have asymmetrical neuronal activity, which is presumably triggered by the incoming input. And this is true for the left and right brain side, at least basically, but we still do not know why, so in a natural situation, information is coming from the left and from the right side, so both hemispheres should be activated. But why do we see a hemispheric dominance for specific stimulus types? So, or more generally, what are the critical stimulus features? And exactly here, priors come into play. We suggest functional symmetries are triggered by the appearance of priors. What are priors? Primarily, they are innate set of stimulus configurations which indicate the presence of pivotal stimuli, which quickly attract attention, which activate inherent, maybe evolutionary conserved feature detectors in the brain at an early level of sensory processing, and which induced fast adaptive responses. A nice example is the face prior, that what are simply 3 dots indicating the presence of a face, and presenting such a prior to newborn human babies or newborn chicks, you directly attract the attention of the little animal, the little individual, leading to a social approach behavior. And interestingly, this response is mediated by the right hemisphere. So, and the face prior might nicely explain how so prior induced asymmetry induction can work. Consider again, just a second. What's going on when you're looking to a face? Then both eyes see the face and the information is mediated up to the striatal cortex within both hemispheres. But very quickly, already 170 milliseconds later, we have a stronger activity within the face processing areas within the right hemisphere. So, as I indicated in the beginning, we have to understand why this is the case. And the case is that prior-like stimuli might prime the face processing areas specifically within the right brain side via subcortical pathways. We know that the face prior or the raw representation or the raw stimuli characteristics of a face are processed via the subcortical route, via the colliculi superior, projecting in the end to the extrastriatal cortex. And this system is quicker. So we have a signal already after 100 milliseconds. So, and this might simply trigger or simply trigger the brain to process. So at a very raw level to process the face information more deeply. And why it is the right hemisphere? Maybe because, so here this raw face recognition system is fed by the magnocellular pathway, processing information of low spatial frequencies. So that is low global configurational analysis, and this is the specialization of the right hemisphere. And therefore, it can be that the right hemisphere is simply more sensitive to this kind of information. And so the right hemisphere is primed to take over this face analysis function by increasing simply the spike density, the degree of activity within the sensitive brain network. And as a consequence, this hemisphere gains a processing advantage, which is propagated along the information processing stream by feed-forward mechanisms. But when this is true, we might expect that the primed hemisphere has a processing, not only a processing, but also an attentional advantage. Prior induced stronger activation early during during processing should reduce the necessary attentional threshold within the dominant hemisphere. And we have some support for this from cueing experiment, which is a word recognition task. This is work from Nichols et al. And so when recognizing words, this can be done with the left as well as the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere benefits from valid cues. So this reduces error rate. But where for invalid cues, this disturbs the right hemisphere. But invalid cues do not disturb left hemispheric performance, indicating there is less attention necessary for the left hemisphere to conduct this language task. So the dominant hemisphere requires less attentional resources. So, and when we talk about attention, we directly think about top-down mechanisms. And I talked about priors, which are generated by bottom-up processes, but we all know that learning, knowledge, previous experiences lead to or increase our knowledge, increasing our predictions about the world, what might happen in within a situation, within the next moment, things like that. So we permanently make predictions, which might also affect, or which also prime left or right hemispheric processing. So maybe these predictions act in a kind of a secondary prior. And when this is true, we we should assume that we can modify hemispheric dominance by the presentation format. So again, in a word recognition task or in a word discrimination task where the participants have to discriminate between words and non-words, the left hemisphere has a processing advantage when the words are presented in the typical horizontal way. And unusual, unexpected organization of the stimulus configuration should change the lateralization pattern. It should level the left hemispheric advantage. And this is exactly what is happening when words are presented within a vertical orientation. Then the left hemispheric superiority is completely lost. So, but top-down mechanisms can induce asymmetric processing, but they are especially necessary to maintain a processing advantage of the dominant hemisphere. And in the end, we also have interhemispheric mechanisms. Commissurious systems might maintain, modify, or level processing asymmetries. They enable a flexible use of left and right hemispheric resources, and they are necessary to combine the expertise of the left and right brain side. But they also play a role for controlling the final motor output. So commissurious systems are responsible for inhibitory interactions. And we can assume that the hemisphere which dominates all processing steps is, so from sensory processing up to higher cognitive functions, then this hemisphere is better able to inhibit contralateral motor activities. And this is what we can see while left and right hand use, there is a stronger inhibition of ipsilateral components when using the right hand compared to inhibition of ipsilateral activity when using the left hand. So after all, the hemisphere which develops faster signal spread takes over response selection and behavior control. That is, in the end, the winner takes all, or it's all about timing. But first, to sum up, everything, our model is a 3-level one, starting with sensory processing. I explained, or I suggested, that priors activate feature detectors at the subcortical level. This increases spike density in the sensitive hemisphere due to neuronal summation, and it leads to a faster signal spread. This has an impact on information processing. We have a time effect, faster processing, and eventually more elaborated processing. So this is the amplitude effect. And here, top-down mechanisms come into play to allocate, for example, attentional focus, and interhemispheric mechanisms come into play for information transfer, exchange, inhibition, integration. And in the end, we have the action generation level. So the faster hemisphere is faster in activating premotor systems. It's able to inhibit the contralateral side, and therefore behavioral dominance results from a winner-takes-all mechanism. Yeah, and this is the model, but we have to prove it, and we have some evidences how these suggested mechanisms are working from electrophysiological work with the pigeons. And therefore, I will end my talk with providing you some of the supporting data. So pigeons are a well-known model for lateralization research, and they are pretty good learners for sure. They can simply learn to discriminate between different colors, and it is the right eye and the left hemisphere in doing that. So the left hemisphere displays a superiority for color discrimination tasks. And we can see this advantage already within the sensory pathway when we have a look to the relevant visual forebrain area, that is the so-called antepallium, but this is not important. Then you will see that there is a higher burst activity on the left side when the pigeons are discriminating different colors. So just to show it here in detail, you see here a higher peak of activity within the left, on the left side compared to the right side. And first of all, this peak is not that strong, but it's significant. And this indicates it's just a simple signal. So the difference does not have to be that great. It's enough to a short advantage of activity is enough to induce asymmetric processing. And by the way, this activity advantage is present already before learning. So when the pigeons only see the some colors, there is a left hemispheric dominance, and this might indicate the action of a prior, because colors can be very useful priors within the real world. So specific colors can indicate some food danger, things like that. But the advantage of the left hemisphere increases after learning. And here, so leading to a faster signal spread. And here, top-down mechanisms also play a role. As I've explained to you, its learning has an impact. And visual processing is controlled by visual forebrain areas projecting down to the primary visual areas. For example, top-down influences affect thalamic visual processing. And here we can see two things. First of all, we have neurons which are completely bottom-up triggered. So and these cells react in an asymmetrical manner to visual stimuli. And then we have a specific cell population which is modulated by top-down input. And this top-down input is completely confined to the left hemisphere. Only left hemispheric neurons are modified by input from the forebrain, can be modulated by previous experiences and learning. And this effect has a time lag. So there is a delay for the impact of top-down influences, and this might enable a more elaborated analysis within the left brain side. This is one thing. The other thing is what's going on along the processing stream, and then we come to cognition and decision making, what to do. And comparable to the mammalian brain, there is a prefrontal area within the avian brain, the so-called NCL, which is responsible for decision making. And here, okay, I will hurry. And here the left hemisphere again has a time advantage. When you correlate neuronal activity with the onset of a first motor response, in our case, it's mandibulation, you see that the left hemispheric activity peaks before onset of the first response, meaning that the left hemisphere is able to trigger a motor response, while the right hemisphere comes too late because it peaks only after onset of a behavioral reaction. So the left hemisphere can exert decision control, and we have to look to premotor areas, which are also present within the avian forebrain. And again, we have a time advantage of the left hemisphere. Left hemispheric neurons within this premotor area are faster in reacting to stimuli. So they are faster to activate downstream premotor activity. They can induce a faster reaction, and interhemispheric aspect comes into play because this premotor area is the region from which interhemispheric interactions start. And it is highly interviewing that this this commissarial system acts in an asymmetrical manner. So only the left hemisphere is able to modulate activity on the right side. It can actively slow down processing on the right, within the right hemisphere, exaggerating its processing advantage. And it's not possible the other way around. So after all, the left hemisphere has a time advantage. And this is exactly what, starting with an asymmetric encoding of sensory information. Yeah, so this is to exemplify what at the physiological level, what our model would suggest. Yeah, and in the end, there are several suggestions for future studies. We can talk about the phylogeny of priors. We have to identify, we might have to identify priors for all relevant cognitive modules or so. We have to understand the ontogeny of the priors and their detection, and we have to investigate the physiology, the underlying physiology. So we have to check if we can really find a prior-induced reallocation of attention, lateralized signal spread, reaction times, things like that. Yes, and so that's from my side. First, I would thank again my co-authors and thank you for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to your feedback, questions, comments, criticisms, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Martina. I'm sure there are questions. As there should be.
Thank you for a very intriguing and interesting talk. I was wondering how you look at the use of priors or the incorporation of priors, which is an interesting concept. Do you see that as kind of unique or restricted to lateralization or for how the hemispheres interact? Or do you see it as a very general principle of how the brain is functioning in general, how we actually interact with the environment? Because as you know, priors have become extremely popular in many fields in cognitive neuroscience now. It's a kind of fashion thing. And even gone into general principles like.
Yes, definitely. So I think prior-like, so priors must be present everywhere in the brain because they tell the processing systems what they help to make sense of the world. So maybe the most famous example are Bach cells within the retina of toads, which directly lead to prey catching behavior in toads. There is no hint that this system, for instance, is lateralized. Everywhere where specific receptors for specific, let's say, molecules, for example, for olfactory processing are present, these act as a kind of a prior because they enable to detect molecules or sensory input from a specific functional category. This system becomes lateralized, maybe because the left and the right brain side acts in a differential manner. So I would suggest it's the internal organization of left and right hemispheric networks which modify the sensitivity to specific aspects of priors or critical features of stimulus category. And maybe this helps us to understand or to integrate both. So how are neural networks within the left and right brain side organized? And this is rooted into genetic and epigenetic mechanisms mediating the appearance of hemispheric specific organizations. And this leads to an asymmetrical sensitivity to specific features. And this might prime one hemisphere to take over a processing advantage within the current situation, but also during development, because due to learning, you can increase the processing advantage for a specific function. Yeah.
Hi, Martina.
Hey.
I was just wondering, you mentioned that priors activate feature detectors at the subcortical level. How do you explain then that sometimes, when you create stimuli that are not conscious, basically, so by creating hybrid stimuli where the lateralized content is actually hidden in the stimuli and it's basically unconscious. So you would actually find, that's at least what we did, only find asymmetries on the cortical level. So how would that fit to your model?
Yeah, so first of all, it might be the nature of a prior that it is unconscious. So that's it. Yeah. So, and maybe, so we don't, it wouldn't exclude that lateralized processing starts already at this subcortical level. But in what I would like to point out here is that this system, even when, so that this subcortical system, even when it's working in a symmetric manner, it activates the cortex asymmetrically because it's the cortex which is asymmetrically sensitive. So yeah, so the feature detectors for this basic for the basic detection is not necessarily asymmetrical, but it's the higher level which yeah, how should I say, which responds in an asymmetrical manner. Yeah, so it's a secondary consequence in many cases, at least for the cortex. As I said, it can be that also subcortical mechanisms can be lateralized, but we do not know enough about that. And this is one aspect which we have to investigate in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Martina.